Okay, hello. So this is part two of the adjudication lecture, particularly on tracking how to better evaluate and weigh debates. So what exactly is tracking? So tracking in and of itself is the skill of following the trail of logic and taking note of the logical points in a speech. It's assessing whether the logical points and links made make sense to you as a judge or to you like as an ordinary intelligent voter. It's also a replication and reflection of a judge's thought process in understanding a debate. So I want to highlight here that I think a lot of people misunderstand that judging is a separate process from how they usually think, when in truth, that's not really the case. Judging is really just about being able to understand yourself in a way where you are cognizant of your personal biases and what the tipping point is for you to believe in something. So this is where it's essentially an assessment of um, at what point do you believe in a debater, or at what point do you believe that this is an argument that is winning? So it is also you trying to be able to understand what your own personal judge values are when it comes to those things. The way that you track a debate is the way that you understand and receive information when people talk to you or when you watch a debate. So it's important that you're able to not just understand how a debate is happening, but also understand how you yourself are understanding that debate, or how you yourself are even processing the information that's coming from a debate or from this speech that you are currently taking note of. It's generally tracking as a skill is an assessment of interaction of contributions between debaters. When you receive information, what exactly does your head or you personally do with it? You compare it with the existing information that you've been given earlier, or do you just let the information exist in a part of your brain? Are you skeptical about information presented? Do you question it? Do you connect the dots between different points, or does the information connect the dots between different points for you? So, similar to the discussion of like trying to assess your thought process, it's also trying to be able to understand what is the response that you're likely to have when you receive information or when you understand a piece of information coming in from a debater. Does your brain subconsciously already try to connect the dots, or try to see how it's being how it's trying to engage with another point of material, or do you have to actively push your brain to be able to make those things, to make those connections, or to assess those interactions? Another thing is tracking is not just note taking, it's not just assessing those things. It's also being able to make initial calls between exchanges. Exchanges meaning between speakers, between teams, things like that. Want to highlight that it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you make a call between the different exchanges, this isn't necessarily your final call. It's still something that is subject to change. The idea behind it is that you're actively questioning why you think certain speakers or teams are winning over the other. And if you are able to answer those questions, you're better able to form justifications and see how else the debate could be perceived or be called in favor for. Tracking is essentially your notes and your lifeline in judging. If you do not track the logical progression of speeches, then this is where you're likely to overwhelm yourself by merely transcribing debater speeches. And as I mentioned in part one, that's not what you should be doing as a judge. You should not be transcribing a debater speech. Tracking also helps you make decisions, as the fact that you are making initial calls between exchanges in and of itself helps you formulate a final decision, insofar as who is the team that might be winning in a particular exchange, or who is likely is going to win over the other. It gives you a purview of like how you're assessing these different types of uh, uh, interactions. And I also want to highlight that tracking as a skill in and of itself isn't just applicable for judges, but it's also applicable for debaters too. So if you're the type of judge that judges during particular seasons, or you go between judge track and debater track, tracking, like honing your skill of tracking, is applicable to both sets of, as I mentioned, judging and debating. So let's try to practice this. I know this is like technically an asynchronous recording, but like let's just walk through this. So this house believes that true women's liberation can never coexist with religion. The government argues that religions are founded on beliefs that are inherently oppressive to women. Most organized religions are paternal, and their beliefs trickle down to values and societal roles, such as Islamic women wearing the hijab, or God having blessed women with a child, and therefore she shouldn't have the right to an abortion. So that is an argument, like, let's say, that OG runs in this motion. As a judge, um, while you can say that you can take it as is, when you're tracking, it's also you being able to assess this specific material that your government or whatever team is running or whatever speaker is running, and trying to question what exactly are the pitfalls, or trying to question to what degree they're able to explain something. I remember in a previous lecture that I had about judging, I also used the same example, and not many people were able to point out what was wrong with this. But I hope that as we're doing this asynchronous lecture, I suppose, you can already spot what exactly is wrong with this argument. So I'll give I guess a second of time. You can probably pause this recording and try to figure out what is wrong with this argument. So that's like 1, 2, 3. So if you haven't paused yet, yeah. But to analyze, this is essentially what's wrong with the argument. So religions are founded on beliefs that are inherently oppressive to women. So this is an unproven assertion, or this is a assumption that is being asserted, but hasn't necessarily been explained how exactly it's inherently oppressive to women. At best, what government asserts here is that organized religions are paternal, but doesn't necessarily provide the link as for, because organized religions are paternal, that means they're inherently oppressive to women. But secondly, there's also a question: how exactly are religions paternal in the first place? That's still a question that still exists. I think it's also still an unproven assertion or an unproven premise. The third part of it being wrong is beliefs trickle down to values and societal roles. I think while it is believable to an extent, the way that government is trying to analyze this or pushes this is by providing examples or explaining through examples such as Islamic women wearing the hijab, or God having blessed women with a child, therefore not having a right to an abortion. Like, those examples, while compelling, don't necessarily explain the train of thought or the logic behind why exactly this means that the beliefs trickle down to societal roles. Perhaps if government was able to discuss how exactly organized religions are paternal and thereby inherently oppressive to women, so like they need to be able to explain those two asserted assumptions, or those two asserted premises, then perhaps it becomes easier for judges and for other people to believe how exactly those values trickle down. Perhaps there could be discussions about how organized religions usually have communities built surrounding them, meaning that people, in order for them to engage with their community members or people, their friends, their families, they also have to opt into the religion. They also have to opt into the specified roles designated by their religious leaders or the religious texts, whether that's the Bible or the Quran, things like that. So the idea behind it is, if you aren't able to spot, like, if you are just someone that just believes that this argument in and of itself is okay, I think like the degree in which you should be scrutinizing it, especially as a judge, should be more like this, like you trying to actively question the parameters of not the parameters. You actively trying to question the degree in which something is proven, whether that is just merely the premise, the underlying assumption that debaters are using as they argue, or particularly the extent in which they analyze certain things. While the degree in which you're analyzing their parameters is not necessarily point in your decision, meaning like just because you think that debaters are wrong in how they argue it, that means they should be given the loss. Remember in part 1, we said that's not how you should be judging debates. But the skill in and of itself of being able to understand what is wrong within an argument or what is missing in the argument allows you to be able to understand the degree in which debaters are explaining things to you and how they're explaining it, or to the quality in which they're explaining it. And that makes it easier for you to be able to assess, especially on metrics like mechanism, or especially in metrics in terms of like the degree of framing and characterization that teams provide, that may be the tipping point in which you might think that the debater, or that the team rather, is winning over the other. So like that's just a preview example of what tracking could look like just on an argumentative level. But ideally, you should be doing these forms of tracking, or these points of comparison, trying to find out how exactly different parts of a speech, different parts of a case, and like what a speaker said, how they interact with one another, whether or not it fulfills another assumption that hasn't been proven, or whether or not it also asserts a similar unproven assertion, things like that. So how exactly do you track? There's two main things that you usually do, which is firstly note taking, and then second is on asking questions. So in terms of note taking, so there are different ways to note take. There's paper. You can use a notebook. You can use sheets of paper. You can also be digital note taking. So you can use Word, Gdocs, Excel, OneNote, or whatever. I know some people use Notion as well. It really depends on you. Or you can also have a mix of both paper and digital. Personally, I use a mix. So I have like a digital OneNote where I track most of the debate, and that's also where I place my comments, my decision. But I also have a paper notebook. I'll be showing it to you later, where specifically I track the exchanges, or where I make my initial calls, as well as the speaker ranges that I provide. So this is what my OneNote looks like. So when judging, usually what I do is I divide my paper into 3 columns. It just looks like more than 3 columns right now because I had to paste all those things together. But I usually divide my OneNote, into 3 columns. The first column, which you see at the utmost left, is like where I place the motion, where I place like the recaps or the clashes that I have between different teams, and then my general comments, my decision, the speaks, and as well as the justification or my OA notes. Whereas the other 2 columns, they are representative of what exactly I've been tracking from different speakers or what I've been tracking from different teams. So there's a legend towards this, so you'll see that some words are bold. Those words in bold are my personal comments or thoughts on particular contributions or particular material. Highlights are usually the things that I use or factor into my decision, or things that are important to note for me as I explain my OA or as I explain why exactly I led to that decision. And then I think it's also important to note here, like I try not to write things verbatim coming from debaters. And that's the reason why I have a preference of writing phrases or words as opposed to writing whole sentences. It just generally makes note taking much easier, and I don't fall into the trap of being just a mere transcriber. There are different ways that people track, but I'm just showing my notes here just so that people who are starting with judging or who want to get into judging are just given ideas as for how they could track for themselves. OneNote is free, so like if you want to use that, you can use that. But I know there are judges that also use Excel, that also use other programs like Word, Gdocs. You can use the same, whatever is comfortable with you. The idea behind it is you are comfortable with being able to use it, but secondly, you also are able to replicate the way that you're perceiving, or replicate your thought process as you go through the entire debate. Personally, the reason why, so there are other judges that might say that personal comments should not be integrated as you're tracking, or at least it should be on a separate piece of paper. That's the reason why people who judge using like just a physically, like judge like with a paper, usually they have a separate paper. So they have one paper for tracking and then one paper for their personal comments and OA notes, which is fair to do. And they usually try not to merge the personal comments with the in-round tracking of the round. But personally, the way that I perceive debates is the reason why I have to place it within the specific section or as I track the actual round is because my comments and my thoughts on the debate in and of itself is like instantaneous. Like it's just something that pops up. And if I just have to go to another column or another paper to switch to it, I might end up forgetting it. So that's the reason why I integrate it. And that's the reason why I just place it in bold as opposed to just like typing it elsewhere. But yeah, that's just a me thing. People can explore. Honestly, I think tracking is a very individual, personal type of thing. It's again, a reflection of your thought process and how you perceive the round or how you perceive debates as a whole. In terms of paper tracking, so this is what I mean by it's mixed. So usually when I judge, I have like a notebook at the side, and that's where I put like the different exchanges that I have. So for this particular set of notes, these are 3D3 tracking notes. If you notice, there's usually one person that I decide to be winning in a particular exchange or per exchange, particularly those are encircled. I don't think I can highlight it or like zoom in. But you'll see that there are some circles surrounding different speaker roles such as PM, LO, things like that. Those are usually indicators that I think that this particular speaker is winning the exchange. But just because the speaker is winning an exchange, as from how I'm tracking it, does not necessarily mean that their team is winning. You'll also notice, if you really scrutinize these notes, I can say that PM is winning, but by the time that the DPM and DPM comes in, the DPM is not winning the exchange, and it might lead to OG not winning at all, or the government not winning at all. Personally, when I track VP though, I, rather than tracking individual speakers, I track team exchanges. So rather than having to track between PM and LO, it's usually OG and OO. So this is what it might look like. If you wanted paper notes, so I'm trying to give ideas as for how you can track on paper or note take on paper. So you can have 2 sheets of paper. One is divided into 4 boxes, or you close it, you have it in the middle, and you have it in the middle to make 4 boxes. So you have OG, OO, CG, CO, and then you have the second sheet of paper where you can also have it, where one column is your in-round notes, and then the other one is your OA notes or justification. There are some judges, when they're writing physically or writing paper notes, they have different colored pens or they have highlighters. So they're able to clearly flag out what specifically are the materials that they're crediting, what specifically are the materials that they ought to be note-taking or considering in their OA justification. Sometimes it's usually to write a comment regarding how a material interacts with one another. But really, you do you. I'm just providing suggestions as for how you can note take and what it might look like. That said, so that was the first part of tracking, the note-taking part. After you optimize your note-taking skills or your note-taking preference in a debate, this is where you go to the second part, and this is where I think tracking is really centered around, which is being able to ask questions. So when you're taking note or when you're tracking a debate, you always have to question different things that are happening in the round. You question, for example, why is the speaker winning over the other? How did the speaker change the course of the debate or change the course of why their team is winning over the other? So it's like so as you assess the material, you're also assessing the impact of that material or the contribution coming from a speaker or from a team, and how that changes your perception of the entire round in and of itself. You also question to what extent was a point proven to be important, so the significance of points. Why is it more important that the other point brought up, or how well did they prove their impact or goal? Do both teams run an incentive analysis of a particular actor? If these incentives conflict with one another, how do teams prove that incentive is likely going to weigh over another actor? It's you having to proactively ask questions. Questions like these helps you better understand not just the material given by debaters or by teams, but also helps you ask yourself how those different materials, how those different contributions interact with one another. Because again, judging is not, when you are a judge, you are not merely judging based on what is the material given, but how material and contributions coming from teams are interacting with one another. It always is a comparison. It is never just in the vacuum of this, because they provided this case, this means that they therefore win. It's always about how does this case or how does this argument compare with another argument or another case? And then based on that comparison, why exactly does a team have to win one over the other? So rather than asking questions of why exactly is this argument wrong, you are trying to ask yourself, how does this argument fare in comparison to another argument? So again, you're always judging based on interactions. Your questions are also based on interactions. What we were doing earlier when we were talking about this part, this one, it's just an assessment of how the material compares, or at least when you're able to spot these wrong things or the quote-unquote missing things in a specific material, this is where you can compare the quality of a specific argument or a specific response in comparison to whatever an opponent might bring up, because they might end up being able to fill in those missing blanks, or they might do it to a better degree or explain things to a better degree than whoever gave this argument that might have missing blanks or that might not necessarily be the best degree of an argument. So again, when you're asking questions, it's not just really asking questions about what went wrong within a specific material, but also how it engages with another material or how it interacts with other contributions coming in the debate. I think it's also important to highlight that tracking is not stepping in. So as a judge, you should not be stepping in the debate. And stepping in usually happens when A, you either complete an argument that wasn't completed or given by another team, whether that's giving additional examples and or analysis. B, it also looks like when you make responses or rebuttals to another team's material and say that's why they lost, even though their opponents never said that response. Or three, it looks like, or C, looks like you adding and imposing things to the debate despite it not being reflected or having manifested inside the debate. So the difference between asking questions and stepping in is just where your questions coming from. Your questions are reflective of whatever happened in the round, or they're usually based on the round as it manifests, as opposed to stepping in where it's your personal input in terms of like it didn't even manifest in the round in and of itself. It's things that you were actively doing that weren't reflected by the round, that weren't reflected by opponents or other debaters within that round. So the line is clear. You're asking questions not to step in, not to complete certain arguments, but you're asking questions because you're trying to assess what exactly happened in the round. It's, as mentioned here, tracking is not stepping in, it's trying to better understand the debate. So that's the reason why you have questions such as how is the team better able to respond to a certain material? Was it implicit? Was it explicit? Does another material engage with the case made by another debater? If so, how? Why is that important for the debate? How does that change your personal understanding or understanding of the round and debate as a whole? You also end up questioning, what is the POI trying to question? What does it aim to do? How does it change the progression of the debate? So there's a difference between stepping in and asking questions. Stepping in is when you start completing arguments, when you start making responses, and thereby giving the loss to teams, even though if no one else in that round said those things, as opposed to asking questions where it's really just trying to scrutinize what exactly happened in the round. That said, how do you evaluate debates based on whatever you track? So in evaluating debates, it's also very important to understand the different motion types and the parameters of the format to know what and what not to credit. That's why reading the judge manual and briefing is important. So in different formats, there are certain degrees, or the degrees in which you can credit what the whip says may differ. So you should always read those briefings. But secondly, the way that you understand motion types could also differ depending on what the briefing or the manual says. Let's first go into motion types. So these are sample motion types that can change the degree of how you understand the debate as a judge and what is likely debaters supposed to do or not supposed to do. So in a this house believes that, or this house opposes and this house supports, it's usually in the neutral observer perspective. It doesn't necessarily ask for logistical or feasibility requirements, meaning that ideally debaters shouldn't necessarily question the feasibility of believing, opposing, or supporting something. In the case of a this house regrets debates, it's usually retrospective or retroactive, meaning that debaters should be assessing whether the world would be a better place with or without the thesis being regretted in the motion. It means, in an ideal world, opposition should not be running for future benefits of a thesis, but rather they ought to assess what's currently happening in status quo and then try to argue why that might be good or why that's something that we should therefore not regret. When you're able to understand motion types, this is where you're better able to understand the degree of what debaters should be doing, or whether or not whatever debaters are doing, whether that's running like a future benefit case or running analysis on which is retrospective in nature. This is where you're able to better understand to what degree you should be crediting these forms of analysis. So this is like just sample motion types, but I suggest reading more on the manuals that better able to exhaust what those different motion types are when it comes to this house would and other forms of motion types, or this house prefers and the like. When exactly are extensions considered new or considered to be reminiscent or a rehash? I think as a debater, as a judge rather, you should be able to question these types of things. Do they rely on the same premises or lead to the same conclusions? Do they explain and mechanize these premises and conclusions? And do they differ in quality? I think it is important that it's quality, the difference is quality, not necessarily wording. I think people misunderstand that just because debaters or people in closing use the same words, that means that they are necessarily the same, which isn't the case. You don't judge an extension based on the words that are used, but rather the degree in which the explanation differs and elevates the debate. So this is why the second question is important under this is, do you better understand the point better from closing theme than opening? And if so, how so? And why is that important? Is it sufficient to tip the decision for closing over opening? I think even at the case that that opening and closing use similar languages, the degree in which they explain things can fundamentally differ depending on the different analysis that they posit. So that's the reason why you have different forms of extensions coming from closing and opening. From closing, whether that's a vertical extension where it may rely on similar premises but leads to different conclusions, or may have the same conclusions, but the mechanisms and analysis that they use may be fundamentally different, or at least the extent of quality in which the mechanisms are proven to lead up to those premises or to lead up to those conclusions significantly differ. So this could look like opening and closing operating on the same conclusions, having the similar premise of an actor existing, but closing comes up and provides a different mechanism in discussing to a better degree what the incentives of actors are, how that incentives are likely going to push them to certain behaviors, or what the externalities are in order to push them to those behaviors or to those conclusions that opening might have also said that they were going to do. So when evaluating, especially like in a vertical extension, when you're trying to evaluate a closing theme compared to an opening theme, what you should be considering is not necessarily on the wording, or just because they have the same premise and the same conclusion, that means that they're automatically a rehash. But you also have to question the degree, the quality or the degree in which they're able to explain things. And considering that degree, how does that change your perspective of the debate? If it doesn't really change your perspective of the debate, and the degree is quite marginal, but like it doesn't really do much for you to believe that a team is going to win over their opening, or it isn't really proven why that therefore is significant within the round, then you could probably say that this is reminiscent. Or you can say that the closing team can edge it out of their opening just on marginally, but still doesn't necessarily mean that they win the debate as a whole. You can also ask yourself questions as whether or not they supplement different premises or prove unproven and asserted conclusions and analysis coming from their opening. And then you also end up questioning how exactly does closing themes or how exactly do closing themes supplement those different premises, or how exactly do they prove those unproven assertions? And then why is it so important that they were able to do those things to the point that it affected your decision, or it changed your perception of the debate, and overall your affected said decision. In terms of being able to evaluate definitional challenges, so in an ideal world, def chals should be made by the leader of opposition or the LO. But there are instances where closing does reframe and challenge the definition set up by opening, which honestly is quite a big headache as a judge and can lead to messy debates. So that's the reason why if you are hardline about the rules, ideally the reframe and the def chal coming from closing shouldn't be credited. However, even if that is the case, judges shouldn't be super anal about the rules, because again, you should always judge a debate based on how it manifested itself. So like if no one's gonna call out a def chal and they run with it or they engage with it, then you judge the debate based on that interaction, right? However, a reframe from closing can be credited depending on the degree of its necessity within the round and how it's explained to be necessary, as noted by closing. So when is a reframe coming from closing, or when does a def chal coming from closing necessary? Usually it happens when opening, like both opening teams, regardless of whether it's OG or CO, misframe the debate for it to be completely selfish, or it ends up squirreling the motion. Or the degree of selfishness varies But I think depending on how closing explains why this therefore means that it's selfish, or why this therefore narrows down the debate to a degree where none of the other teams can engage, this is where necessity as a solution, or necessity could be proven when trying to discuss why it was important to reframe. Just because there's a reframe in closing, however, does not necessarily mean that closing should stop engaging with opening. After all, opening or closing is still burdened to respond to the opening material, and they should be able to weigh the frames as to prove why the reframe is necessary and fair. So even if there's a reframe, that doesn't necessarily mean they should stop engaging with opening. But secondly, reframes in and of itself as a strategy coming from closing is pretty risky, because it is highly dependent on whether or not people are willing to engage with your reframe. But secondly, whether or not you are still able to balance out dishing out your reframe while also being able to engage and weigh with the other frames existent in the round. After all, the reason why the rule asked for why ideally you shouldn't be crediting reframes coming from closing was because opening teams are unable to respond to a completely new frame coming from closing. It also follows a similar principle as for why whips should not be able to run new arguments or new arguments, or provide new matter, because no one else in the round is able to respond to them. So it's really relative to what degree you're able to credit reframes or def chals coming from closing. And it really depends on how exactly your closings are able to execute it within the round, whether that's them being able to explain the significance or necessity of that reframe and def chal, and whether or not they're able to balance out dishing out such a reframe or such a def chal, while also being able to balance out being able to still be responsive and relevant to whatever the material and contribution is coming from opening and from the other closing. When it comes to weighing frames and models, so similar to frames and characterizations, they form the context of debate, but rather than perceiving them as a premise, like being able to weigh frames and models, you perceive that you understand them as a policy, or as noted, the model of a particular team. In a this house would ban guns debate, let's say, OG sets up that government bench model of banning looks like banning guns for civilian usage. They'll still use guns in the context of the military and war, whereas O's counter model, on the other hand, is allowing civilians to use all guns, but placing regulations. So you ought to be able to weigh what those frames look like. I think in this case, is it something similar to one another, or is it something that fundamentally differs from one another? So weighing models is generally like weighing the whole debate. Why is X model preferable over the other? What are the impacts? What are the extents of said impacts? How are these things exclusive? Is the model helpful or counterintuitive to the goals set out by the debate or set out by debaters themselves? It's also important to note that there's a difference in providing a new model and clarifying a model in comparing opening teams to their closing. So sometimes closing teams, they can run similar premises because they are relying on a similar model or the same model coming from their opening. However, they might make differences, or they might cite out differences to clarify that this is what the model specifically looks like, or add on to the existing model coming from opening teams. So comparing material. This is where you start to compare, or at least try to scrutinize what exactly are the contributions coming from debaters, and it's still about asking questions, because in order for you to evaluate the debate, you have to evaluate what are the contributions that exist in the debate, right? So you question, what is the premise or underlying assumption of this analysis and argument? How does it interact with another material coming from an opposing team? To what degree is something being explained? Yeah. Are debaters just using fancy buzzwords, or do they explain what those buzzwords mean? Or to what extent is it proven to be important for the debate and the goals set out by teams? So if you imagine it, tracking in and of itself, it's like you're comparing the material of teams as is, but you're also being able to compare the material in comparison to another team. So you are like tracking different logical progressions, not just of the points in and of themselves, but also the way that the debate is evolving. So when you're evaluating debates, you have to be able to scrutinize not just the material of teams, but again, how it compares or how it interacts with another material or another contribution from another team. And that's where the other part of it, which is comparing teams. How does the material between a team and their opponents compare and interact? What happens in that interaction? So it's when you're judging, you should be able to explain these things, or at least being able to explain how does an interaction or clash between teams manifest itself, and how does that lead you to sway a decision. Comparing teams and evaluating debates and asking these types of questions helps you justify those types of things. So when you're trying to ask what happened in an interaction, you question, was there a shadow of doubt created when you compare these two materials, or when these two materials clash upon one another? Is there a contention or contradiction illustrated within a team's material, considering a response or considering another call out coming from another team? Is there a deadlock? Are the impacts supposedly or called out to be symmetrical, or to a degree proven to be symmetrical? If it is symmetrical, do teams attempt to weigh the extent? To what degree can you credit that symmetry? So all these questions are necessary in order for you to be able to understand what exactly happened in that interaction. And at the point in which you are understanding what is happening in that interaction and you're able to flag it out, this is where you're better able to justify, or at least explain to debaters how you perceive the debate, or how you perceive those points of clashes and those forms of interactions. Are the goals and impacts of teams similar? How do they differ in mechanism or premises? If teams are running fundamentally different frames, can these frames coexist? What degree can you credit these frames? So I think the way that you ought to be evaluating debates, like, it's very easy for me to discuss what those questions are that you should be asking as you track debates or as you evaluate debates. But it's really just being able to practice trying to ask yourselves these different questions as you're going through a debate or as you're judging a debate as a whole. However, there are instances where teams run fundamentally different frames, where it could be difficult to judge a debate depending what frame you credit over the other. And the team could lose or win depending on the frame that is being credited. My personal strategy to this is just to credit both frames, and then I find another point of comparison to weigh the interaction, or to weigh the contribution coming from teams. So unfortunately, this is something that happens a lot, where teams do not weigh frames and they don't tell you why exactly is something more important over the other. So it ends up being a parallel debate where a team is running in their own world or their own bubble, their own frame, and then another team is running in their own bubble and their own frame. Depending on what frame that you credit, this means that, they're going to win over the other team. But that's a messy debate, and it would be reflected in your OA if you say that, I credited this frame, despite the fact that the debate may not have necessarily manifested reasons or discussed reasons why this frame is more credible over the other. So usually in those instances, when debaters don't do the work of trying to tell judges why a frame should be credited over the other, whether that's implicit or explicitly, my go-to strategy is really just credit both frames and then try to find another way to compare the material. Usually the way that I compare the material, if I don't base it off the frames, I usually try to see how they respond to one another, or to what degree they're able to explain their impact, to explain their mechanisms, and then how it proves their impacts. And from there, that's usually the point of comparison that I use. So that's generally how you evaluate debates. There are really different ways that you can track a debate, insofar as note-taking, insofar as the questions that you ask yourself. But the skill of tracking in and of itself cannot just be practiced, but it cannot just be like given as is in a lecture. It needs to be practiced. And the best way that you practice is really just watching debates and then asking yourselves all these questions as you note take whatever the contributions are coming from teams. So yeah, I hope that helps. That is for part 2 on this adjudication lecture. The next part will be on oral adjudication, particularly on how to improve giving OAs and giving feedback. So yeah, thanks.